The 100 Years' War, actually neither a war nor lasting 100 years, was the term applied by later historians to a period of conflict between the English and French for 116 years between 1337 and 1453. Why? When the English and French had been more or less at it since the Frenchman William the Bastard had come over in 1066 and did so well, they changed his name to the Conqueror. The issue was that since the time of William, the English nobility were, in a very real sense, French. Many of England's kings from 1066 onwards were born in France. Richard the Lionheart spent most of his time there. All spoke French as their first language, and they held and fought for land in France. A crucial change from this happy state of affairs came in 1328 when the French king Charles IV died with no male heir, and the English king Edward III, as the nephew of Charles, held a strong claim to succeed his uncle. Certainly at least as strong as the man the French magnate eventually chose to succeed him, Philippe Valois, the dead king's cousin. And so Edward, aggrieved and belligerent, returned to that well-worn tradition of the English invading France, but this time as a claimant not just of land, but of the crown itself. The century or so of turmoil that followed would see a growing sense of national identity in both France and England, the deaths of millions to war and disease, a French king who thought himself made of glass, and the invention of the handkerchief. Early annihilations of the French at Crécy in 1346 brought not just evidence of the deadly effectiveness of English and Welsh longbowmen, but crucially also of loot. But even after the crown had taken their customary third share, there was still plenty to go round. Towns and castles to strip bare, villages to loot and burn, noblemen to take captive and ransom. Especially profitable when you managed to capture the French king himself, which the English did after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. However, what did obstruct English ambitions in this early period was that notorious foe of all invading armies, disease, which ravished Europe in the form of the Black Death between 1347 and 1351. It left about half the population dead, including Edward III's daughter Joan, at the time making her way to Castile for her wedding. And whilst further calamity was to strike for the English first in 1376, with the death of Edward's charismatic son, the Black Prince, and Edward himself a year later, leaving Edward's grandson Richard the Peasants II on the throne, him the inventor of the handkerchief. The French were and remained for successive generations unable to fully capitalise due to incessant infighting between the French kings and their nobility, the odd minor victory notwithstanding. For it was during much of this period that successive French dukes of here and there spent as much time intriguing against each other as against the English. The most remarkable consequence of this realpolitik surely being the astonishing rise of the Kingdom of Burgundy, under successive dukes fantastically named Philip the Bold, John the Fearless, and Philip the Good, all of which at the expense of the French state. Throw in the odd Game of Thrones-esque assassination here and there, of course remembering to accuse your rivals of using black magic, and at a stroke France graduates to catastrophic civil war, just as a rejuvenated England under the martial prowess of Henry V sweep yet again into France, burn and loot, and happily crush French resistance at Agincourt in 1415. This victory and the subsequent Treaty of Troyes in May 1420, which promised Henry the French crown once Charles VI had died, represented the high point of English success during this period, and certainly for the French, a crushing blow, being as they were governed by warring regional factions, and a king, the aforementioned Charles, who had meanwhile gone insane, and was now spending his time installing iron rods into his clothing, lest his glass body should shatter when he next fell over. Except, of course, dysentery. Yes, Henry V died of dysentery in 1422, 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes. And once again the English are ruled by a feckless man-child, Henry VI, who regrettably did not manage to invent anything as cool as the handkerchief, so much as get himself deposed by a rival noble dynasty and locked in the Tower of London. But such fun and games were yet to come. Back in 1428, the frankly remarkable Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who somehow managed to convince the French king, now Charles VII, to give her command of a small army, led the successful relief of her compatriots at the expense of the English at the siege of Orleans, not only a military victory, but an important boon for French propaganda. The English, being suitably alarmed, had her burnt at the stake 3 years later in 1431. However, the point for the French had been made, and a resurgent military now buoyed by a new alliance between the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, and Charles VII, proceeded over the next 20 years to recapture English-held lands, first Normandy in 1449, and finally Guyenne in 1453. Bringing to an end 3 centuries of English presence in southwest France, and to the period we now call the 100 Years' War. There was, however, a hilarious postscript to these events when, in 1474, Edward IV of England, allied with the new Duke of Burgundy, landed a large force in Calais, except instead of engaging the French, the 2 opposing armies just stared at each other across the Somme River. Edward then negotiated an annual payment plan from the French and left. France eventually took Calais in 1558. The English and later British kings continued to claim the title of King of France until 1801.